This story is about a human exchange student named Riley, who stuns a room of alien biology students by explaining how his fragile species survives without regrowing limbs or backup organs. What starts as a smug Q&A turns profound as Riley shares the hard truths of human medicine, recovery, and the bonds that make survival possible, not through biology, but through care, pain, and connection. One question changes everything. Let's find out what this extraordinary story has in store for us. The lecture hall shimmered under the greenish glow of spectral orbs, suspended mid-air to accommodate the varied ocular spectrums of its students. Dozens of species buzzed, blinked, or clicked in anticipation, each crammed into custom-designed seats at the prestigious Intergalactic Academy of Biology. Today's topic had promised something peculiar. Professor Glera, a gelatinous, sea-foam-hued entity known for its obsessive cataloging of xenophysiology, floated to the center of the podium platform and extended 3 pseudopods in a fluid, almost musical gesture. Today, it burbled, we turn our collective sensory organs to one of the most baffling sapient species in this quadrant, Terrans, specifically Homo sapiens. A ripple of skepticism passed through the auditorium. Rylene of Marnos, whose 6-lobed brain had been rated in the top percentile of the Suran cluster, snorted audibly through its upper carapace. What could we possibly learn from a species that can't even regrow its ocular stalks? And who still uses combustion for locomotion, muttered Lexel of Kriv, adjusting his exosuit to mimic a bored slouch. At the center of it all, seated with shoulders too square and eyes too tired for someone his age, was Riley Evans. 27 years old, 5'11", human male. Nervous in a way that made the hairs on his forearms stand up when too many eyes, or the equivalent thereof, turned his way. He straightened when the professor waved a pseudopod toward him. Mr. Evans has agreed to participate in today's Q&A. Prepare your queries. The first question was expected. How do you manage basic survival, croaked an Inari student, with only one cranial core and no internal redundancies? Well, Riley began, voice steadying, we survive because we learned how to protect that one brain. Helmets, safe vehicles, protocols. We don't just rely on biology, we build systems around it, layers of external safety. A screeching chirp came from a Salkran trio seated mid-tier. But what if you lose a limb? No regrowth? Riley held up his left hand, where the index and middle fingers bore a subtle difference in coloration and shape. These are prosthetic. I lost them in a metal shop accident at 15. Wasn't even dramatic, just a stupid moment. But the replacement tech? We got it down to the nerve endings. The room stilled slightly. For many of the species gathered, losing a limb meant 3 days of inconvenience before full regrowth. A child's scrape, nothing more. The idea of replacing a body part rather than growing it anew was quaint, almost barbaric. But that doesn't explain longevity, came a deep rumble from Thornek, a boulder-sized entity from the Kural asteroids. 80 solar years, with soft organs, with heartbeats? Medical systems, Riley replied. Diagnostics, preventive care, pharmaceuticals. We screen for issues early, monitor organs, stabilize conditions, surgeries, and honestly, a lot of our longevity comes from community. People watch out for each other, they remind you to go to the doctor, they drive you to the ER, they sit beside your hospital bed. Some students blinked or glowed in confusion. Community. Rylene buzzed again. But if your bodies fail, and your minds can't be backed up digitally, how do you survive catastrophic failure, say, multi-organ collapse? The room hushed. Riley inhaled slowly, his spine straightened slightly, as if some invisible brace were locking in place. I'm actually here because I received a full liver transplant last year, from my dad. The silence was no longer skeptical, it was reverent. Professor Glera made a low hum of acknowledgement. Terran hepatic tissue is notably slow in regeneration, if at all. This required invasive surgery? Yes, Riley said. Both of us were in surgery for hours. My dad volunteered when my autoimmune liver failure got worse. Recovery took months. Pain meds, physical therapy, constant blood work. He couldn't walk more than 10 minutes without rest for a while. I had complications, fever spikes, clotting issues, but we made it through. Together. He left it at that. No dramatic flair. Just the simple, crushing honesty of it. It was unheard of among most of the species present. Donating an organ to another? Choosing to compromise one's own bodily integrity? Willingly? And for family? The Academy's translator system hummed with subtle recalibrations. Even it struggled to translate the undercurrents of what had just been said. One student raised a trembling tendril. But he reduced his own biological efficiency to prolong yours? Riley nodded. Yeah, that's what we do. We don't just let each other go. That's not our way. Professor Glire drifted closer, observing Riley with an intensity that was more akin to reverence than academic curiosity now. And you recovered fully? Still working on it, Riley said with a shrug. Got regular checkups, meds for life. It's not easy, but it's worth it. Every extra year I get is one I live for, both of us. The room fell into a prolonged, contemplative silence. What started as a condescending curiosity had morphed into something raw and quiet. A recognition, no instant healing, no neural backups, just pain, effort, and solidarity. Somehow, this soft-bodied monocranial species had clawed their way to an 80-year lifespan, not by evolving stronger biology, but by building an unbreakable lattice of trust and shared struggle. And for the first time in the long history of the Intergalactic Academy of Biology, someone whispered the unthinkable. Maybe we've been doing it wrong. The lecture was supposed to end after 90 clicks. Protocol demanded it, but no one moved. Riley sat still, hands folded, eyes on the projection dome above, which was now swirling with data overlays from Earth. Surgical statistics, prosthetic schematics, neural imaging, and social health metrics. The alien students stared, not at the data, at him. When the silence broke, it came from a pair of shimmering flits from the aquatic moon of Nursey 7. They hovered on anti-grav disks, their translucent fronds quivering with something akin to nervousness. You spoke of physical therapy, one of them said haltingly. What is that? Why does it not regenerate functionality? Riley leaned forward. Because our muscles and nerves don't just spring back after damage. When something's injured, like after surgery or trauma, we have to retrain it. Gradually. Repeated movements, targeted exercises, weeks or months of rebuilding. The fronds curled slightly inward in what their translator registered as mild horror. So your recovery is a personal task? Not entirely, Riley said. We have teams, therapists, nurses, specialists. But yeah, we have to put in the work ourselves. It's slow, painful, but it works. A student from the Lithari conglomerate, whose species had crystalline neural backups and automatic organ duplicators, raised an appendage made entirely of light and silicon. Your pain, you feel it during healing? Every step of it, Riley said. We manage it with meds, but there's a limit. Our bodies need to feel some pain to gauge progress. Too much and we risk setbacks. Too little and we might overstrain. It's a constant balance. Another pause. Then Thornick's voice again, deeper now. Then your healing is interactive? Exactly, Riley nodded. Healing's not automatic, it's intentional. There was a shuffle from the back as a new cluster entered second-year students returning from a field dissection. One of them, a Corellian named Nim, who had never said a word in class before, peered at Riley as if trying to decipher an ancient code. And what happens, Nim asked, when one of you is too damaged to recover? What if the pain never goes away? Riley's face twitched slightly, but not from discomfort. He took a breath. Then we don't go through it alone. We build systems to manage long-term pain. We lean on others. Some of us volunteer to care for people full-time, parents with disabled children, spouses caring for the injured. We build communities around people who can't be fixed. The murmurs rippled again. Not because of disbelief, but because the concept of sustaining a life that was no longer efficient was unthinkable to many of the species present. Efficiency isn't everything, Riley added. To us, someone who suffers and survives, especially with help, is still living a life worth fighting for. Rylene, silent since the liver revelation, finally spoke. You said you received an organ from your father. That implies your species allows for inter-family organ transfer? But isn't it risky? Doesn't it shorten the donor's lifespan? It can, Riley said, but not always. The human liver is unique. It can regenerate partially up to a point after donation. My dad gave me about 60% of his. He's fine now, back to gardening and pretending he doesn't worry about me. A pause, then a whisper from a small spherical student from the Solvix Union. But why would he do that? Riley's smile was tired. Because he loves me, that's it. That's the only reason he needed. At the back, Professor Glarus slowly dimmed the presentation dome. It spoke gently, for once bypassing its usual booming projections. Let us shift this session. All those who wish to observe a human medical practice, an outpatient diagnostics tour, meet in Lab Ring 4. Mr. Evans, would you be amenable? Riley nodded, slower this time. Sure, as long as someone tells me if we're walking through a decompression chamber again. I still have a bruise from last time. The students didn't laugh, but several of them pulsed with a hue the translator identified as reluctant amusement. Later, in Lab Ring 4, the alien students surrounded holographic reconstructions of human diagnostic procedures. A simulated human torso displayed a damaged ACL, its ligaments frayed like twisted cords. Riley walked them through the process: MRI scans, orthopedic consultations, insurance delays, surgical prep, post-op immobilization, then months of careful rehabilitation. That's 14 weeks on crutches, Riley said. Then another 8 in physical therapy. Some people recover faster, some slower, depends on age, health, and access to care. Lexel of Crib blinked. Your species lives nearly a century, and yet your tissues fail so easily. Why haven't you engineered self-repair? Riley shrugged. We're working on it. We've made big strides in tissue scaffolding, gene therapy, synthetic organs, but evolution didn't give us much in the way of natural repair. So we went another way. You built a culture around surviving anyway, Thornick said. Riley met his gaze. Yeah, we did. Professor Glura watched the exchange from a corner, its translucent form dimming in contemplation. Then it turned to the class. Tomorrow, we will dissect a failed Varelian cortex cluster. For today, however, I recommend reflection. Riley, still clutching a glass of electrolyte solution his anti-rejection meds always left him dehydrated, smiled faintly. Reflection's underrated. By the third solar cycle, Riley was no longer a curiosity. He was a case study. Overnight, a flurry of cross-species proposals swamped Professor Glara's console. Requests to audit Earth medical data, simulate trauma recovery scenarios, even map the psychological effects of long-term healing without regenerative biochemistry. The Academy's MedTech lab had to reroute a third of its bandwidth just to handle the model adaptations for human limitations. Riley had become less of a novelty and more of a challenge, an unsolvable riddle with a pulse. It started with one student from the Narelian fringe Drux, a graduate researcher with dual respiration systems who submitted a question during the pre-lab intake. What happens to your species when access to care is denied? Riley didn't answer right away. That day's practical was a simulated spinal injury. The room dimmed as a human silhouette flickered into view, slumped over an accident schematic involving a two-wheeled vehicle called a motorcycle. The spinal column, battered and out of alignment, glowed red. Without intervention, Riley said eventually, paralysis, sometimes permanent. In worst-case scenarios, death. It depends on how fast emergency services respond. where it happens, whether the person has insurance, or lives somewhere with universal care. Drux's gill fronds twitched. So, inequality. More than we'd like to admit, Riley said. That's part of why our systems are always evolving. We debate, fight for policy changes, volunteer. We fill the gaps with community efforts when we can. The hologram shifted to the surgical phase. Riley narrated through the stages. Imaging, stabilization, spinal fusion. He emphasized how fragile it all was. No nanite reconstruction, no bone regrowth, just rods, screws, grafts, and luck. And the patient wakes up in pain, asked a thin, starfish-like student named Vex. They wake up grateful, Riley said. And then they start the long climb back. The lecture adjourned early, but nobody left. They lingered in small clusters, replaying data, whispering in tones Riley had come to recognize not of mockery, but of rethinking. By the end of the week, Riley's personal schedule had shifted. Not by choice. He found himself dragged into late-night panels moderated by ethicists from Safranis 9. He stood under hot blue lights while biomechanics students recreated human joints out of low-density polyfibers and tried to understand why something so breakable could work for so long. And then there was the surprise request from the Academy's Board of Observers. "You've been summoned for a demonstration," Clara informed him one morning. "They want to see a human in assisted recovery." "I'm not injured right now," Riley said, raising an eyebrow. "No," the professor replied, "but they wish to understand how someone like you continues to function after—" So Riley showed them. He brought in his medication routine, the twice-daily pills to suppress his immune system, the enzyme boosters for digestion, the supplements to compensate for absorption loss. He explained the strict dietary rules, the lab tests every 2 weeks, the risk of infection from what most aliens considered harmless. And he didn't sugarcoat the setbacks. He detailed the fatigue, the days when climbing a flight of stairs was too much, the hospital stays triggered by mild fevers, the constant internal calculation, is this pain normal or is it something worse? Then, as requested, he demonstrated his daily rehab protocol, stretching, core strengthening, balance work. Not because he was still recovering, but because he would never stop maintaining. That was the cost of staying alive. At the end, one of the observers, an ancient being from a planet where cellular immortality was common, tilted its head slightly. Why endure all this when your species could, with genetic overhaul, pursue a more sustainable path? Riley had been expecting that question. Because we aren't trying to erase our limits, we're trying to learn how to live with them. The board recessed in silence. 2 days later, Riley's comm device chirped mid-lunch, an odd hour to be summoned. He arrived at Medchamber 6, where Glare waited beside a containment unit humming with sterilization pulses. "This is for your benefit," the professor said, gesturing to the chamber. Inside, a hybridized prosthetic limb was suspended in anti-grav. Its joints were modeled on Riley's old injury scans, but the musculature was Krivian self-stabilizing, heat-sensitive, flex-reactive. It was designed to be stronger, lighter, more adaptive. "We developed this with your input logs," Glar said. "Not to replace your function, but to augment it, should your current prosthetics fail." Riley stared, not in awe, in wary surprise. "You're offering this to me? It's already calibrated to your gait." Riley hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I'll try it." Beating it was a careful process, not flashy, not instant. His nerves didn't integrate in minutes. There were tests, minor misfires, tension at the wrist. But when it finally synced and he flexed those fingers, light as air but firm as steel, he looked up, stunned. "I didn't even know I needed this." Glora pulsed in a rare, warm tone. "That is the human trait we admire most. Not your endurance, not even your community, but your openness to being helped." Riley didn't speak for a while. His throat tightened too much for that. He stayed behind after most students left. Adjusting to the new prosthetic was subtle work, Everything felt slightly misaligned. His center of gravity, his perception of force, his confidence. But after an hour of pacing and lifting, it began to feel natural. And that's when Rylene entered. Alone. "I was wrong," the alien said, not looking at him directly. "About humans. I thought surviving without regeneration meant stagnation, that you were just stubborn." "That's a terrible guess," Riley said, adjusting the wrist joint again. "We're definitely stubborn. But now, I think you're resilient because of your limitations. You make up for what your bodies lack. Not with biology, with will." Riley chuckled, then winced from a muscle spasm near his lower back. "Will and painkillers." Rylene tilted its head. "Would you allow me to study your recovery data from the transplant? Privately. I wish to understand more." "Sure," Riley said, "as long as you promise not to simplify it into something clean." None of it was clean. "I won't," Rylene said. "I understand now. Survival for your kind isn't efficient. It's intimate." And somehow, that word hung heavier than any spoken yet. The Intergalactic Academy of Biology officially declared the Human Physiomedical Series closed after 53 hours of instruction, 12 lab demonstrations, and one very confused Norellian who fainted during a video of dental surgery. But for Riley, the series hadn't really ended. Word had spread, not just through the biology cohort, but across departments. The psychology annex requested a guest talk on resilience. Engineering students asked to shadow him during routine maintenance of his prosthetic. Even the diplomatic faculty, usually aloof, submitted a formal request to analyze human medical ethics for cross-cultural modeling. It was overwhelming and exhausting. By the end of the second week, Riley stopped going to the Academy Cafe because he couldn't finish a sandwich without someone asking how kidneys worked or what pain felt like on a scale from 1 to 10. He spent more time alone, not withdrawn, just quiet, centered, letting himself recalibrate. That's when the request came in. Not from a student or professor. It came from the Academy's pediatric bio wing. The younglings were part of a species from the Zoral Reach, born with fragile protoshells and high morbidity in their early stages. Their species didn't understand fear of death until adolescence, and so their education included mortality introduction modules, carefully designed lessons to prepare them for what their culture called existence interruption. They'd heard about the human who lived with a borrowed organ. They wanted to meet him. Riley stood before a class of 23 small beings shaped like floating sea lilies. The instructor, a serene creature named Frawl, gestured gently. They don't know how to ask. They haven't been introduced to suffering in their curriculum yet. But they've been told that you've experienced loss of function and that you chose to keep going. Riley squatted so he was eye level with them. He didn't lecture. He told a story. He described being 17 and tired all the time, how his skin turned yellow and the whites of his eyes looked like candle wax, how doctors ran tests and the words autoimmune hepatitis didn't feel real until they handed him a pamphlet. He described the transplant, the waiting list, the night his dad sat beside him in silence, then finally said, "If they'll take part of mine, they're going to." He described waking up after surgery with a pain in his side that felt like being stitched to the inside of the world, and how he knew right then he had to make those hours worth it. The little exoral younglings didn't move. Some dimmed slightly, one floated closer. Did it hurt every day? Not every day, Riley said, but enough that I stopped taking good days for granted. And you were scared? He nodded. Very. But scared doesn't mean you stop. It means you keep going, even if you shake while doing it. Frawl gently tapped the floor to indicate session's end. The younglings shimmered in farewell. As Riley turned to leave, Frawl spoke softly. We thought we'd be teaching them about mortality, but instead you showed them meaning. Riley smiled. That's how we survive, not by escaping pain, but by making it mean something. Back at his dorm later that night, Riley slumped into the diagnostic chair for his scheduled vitals scan. The prosthetic limb calibrated with a pleasant hum. His immune markers were stable, enzyme levels holding, slight dehydration, nothing unusual. He stared at the ceiling, eyes tracing the projected constellations that mimicked Earth's night sky. A message blinked into view. Incoming com Rylene of Marnos. Requesting live chat. He accepted. Rylene appeared as a flickering hologram, uncharacteristically hesitant. I submitted a paper, it said, based on your recovery trajectory. I titled it Biological Fragility and the Architecture of Human Endurance. Catchy, Riley said, smirking slightly. It's being archived in the permanent collection, Rylene continued. Your case will be part of the Academy's Historical Compendium on Adaptive Species. Riley didn't speak right away. Then he said, Is that why you called? No, Rylene said. I wanted to ask you something I didn't dare ask during the lectures. Go for it. If your father hadn't been compatible, what would you have done? Riley paused. Not because he didn't know the answer, but because saying it aloud carried weight. I would have waited. Hoped. Trusted the system. Trusted people. And if it didn't work out, I'd still have known I didn't face it alone. Rylene was silent for a long time. Finally, it said, You have no backups, no regrowth, no fail-safes, and yet you built an entire civilization on the premise that someone will choose to stand beside you even in your weakest moment? That's the whole deal, Riley said. We fall apart, but we don't let each other stay broken. Rylene nodded once, then disconnected. The end of term came with little fanfare. Most exchange students prepared to leave, returning to their respective systems with packed data cores and strange souvenirs, protein bars, scalp massagers, old Earth movies with outdated subtitles. On his final morning at the academy, Riley stood alone on the viewing deck, staring at the twin suns. His vitals pinged green, liver enzymes stable, no rejection. He heard the whir of approaching lift legs. It was Glera. The board wishes to offer you an honorary distinction, the professor said, not as a patient, as an educator. The title is symbolic, but rare. Riley didn't say anything for a moment. Then, I'll take it, but only if they spell my name right this time. Glare pulsed faintly. You changed us, without meaning to. We assumed resilience came from regeneration. Now we understand it comes from effort, from how you face fragility. Riley looked back out at the suns. We all break, he said. Humans just decided we're worth the trouble of putting back together. He left the academy that afternoon. No parade, no ceremony. Just a man with a borrowed liver, a prosthetic hand, a stubborn heartbeat, and a species behind him that refused to quit. And somehow, to everyone who had witnessed what he endured, that was more incredible than any miracle biology could invent.